name is Julian Cook. I'm an associate here at REMI. I'm joined by Haojie Guan. She's one of our economic analysts at REMI. In today's webinar, we're going to be covering Maryland's new tax on big tech's advertising revenue. We would encourage questions. You can write them anytime, but we'll be answering them mostly at the end. And thank you all for coming. You can go ahead and get started. So quick, brief overview. We're going to identify some key questions that we want to answer throughout this presentation and discuss those a little bit towards the end and throughout the presentation. We're going to take a look at Maryland's current budget, especially during COVID. And then we're going to look at digital advertising on the rise and how it's been growing and how it's likely to grow in Maryland as well. Then we're going to break down the bill a little bit, look at a bit of its history and where its inspiration came from. And from there, we'll break down the potential responses / effects of the bill. And finally, we're going to move on to the modeling aspect and discuss a bit the importance of economic modeling and the role it can play in this kind of legislation. And Haojie will lead the model demonstration and present the results from that. And then we'll end with a brief Q&A. However much time we have left at the end, you all can ask questions and we'll do our best to answer them. So briefly, quickly about us, if you're not familiar with what REMI does, we're founded on the idea that government decision makers should test the economic effects of their policies before they're implemented. We're the nation's leader in dynamic local, state, and national policy modeling. We provide REMI models to perform rigorous economic analysis all throughout the United States in both public and private organizations. A brief list of some of our clients is listed below, just to give you an introduction to REMI if you haven't heard of us before. Next, we want to look at some of the key questions that we hope to answer. Excuse me. Whoops. So first one is looking into how states can address revenue shortages as COVID relief spending slows down. So as that federal aid wanes and as the COVID pandemic comes to a close, how can states fill that gap that they've been dependent on for the past year and a half? And next, we want to answer the question about how will a new tax on digital ad revenue affect the key market players? So how will it affect big tech? How will it affect local companies? And how will it affect consumers within the state and as well as the big tech companies outside of the state? And next, since Maryland is the first state to do this, will it serve as a model for the rest of the United States, or will it serve as a cautionary tale? What can other states learn from the Maryland case study? And finally, what role can economic modeling play in helping decision makers draft legislation? So how can REMI models or just models in general aid in the actual legislation and how that looks and what kind of the parameters are set to? So let's begin with looking at the funding for the Maryland budget. So this table right here is for the fiscal year 2021. We see that general funds account for 41% of total budget, and then federal funds that are non-COVID related account for just under 36%. Special funds account for 21%, and federal funds for COVID this year account for 1.14%, totaling $522 million. And that number dropped from 1.5 billion in the fiscal year of 2020, and it's going to drop even further to I think around 1.7 million for the fiscal year of 2022. So federal funds in the past 2 years have accounted for a fairly large portion of Maryland's budget, and we see it kind of waning drastically. So there needs to be something to address that dependence as the economy recovers in each state, and particularly Maryland. It needs something to kind of support it through this time after post-pandemic, but before a total recovery is made. Next, we'd like to look at the budget allocation, so how that budget is spent and where resources are being allocated. The top three are health, education, and transportation. Those receive the bulk of the funds. Education and health are were very pivotal in the pandemic. Health for obvious reasons, and then education as students were doing remote learning and learning at home. and the whole education system had to kind of adapt to that. A lot of funding went towards that and towards supporting those systems. And then there'll be a switch back to in-school learning after the pandemic, hopefully. That will kind of free up the economy more and free up people to do their jobs. And I should note that in the past several years, the governor of Maryland has kind of one-upped himself on education spending in the state. He's done a record number every year, and so with the federal COVID relief, he's kind of continued that trend, and hopefully with this new legislation that will continue as well. Now looking at digital advertising revenues across the whole United States, we see a steady growth from 2010 till now. So in 2010, it's about 25 billion in revenue, and now we're in 2020, or now we're in 2021, but in 2020, revenues totaled 139.8 billion for the entire United States. So this is a large and growing untapped revenue stream in the US that Maryland legislators are trying to kind of harness for their spending in their budget. In advertising in Maryland, this is general advertising, not exclusively digital. This is from the Maryland General Assembly, these numbers. So 14.6% of economic activities in Maryland are generated by advertising, and advertising helps produce 14.9% of all jobs in Maryland. So the key takeaway here is that advertising plays a large role in the Maryland economy, and any changes around it should be thoroughly investigated, as it could have effects for everyone involved, all market players, all people who hold jobs in that industry, all people whose companies rely on advertising to kind of promote itself. And as digital ads become more prominent in the US, Maryland will follow suit. So as ads kind of move more towards that digital space and away from the print space or the public space, we'll see those digital ad revenues rise, especially as after this pandemic shift to a digital world. Next, so let's break down the bill a little bit. Maryland is the first state to approve such a tax on big tech in the United States. The way it came to be was originally introduced, and the governor vetoed it, and then the state legislature overrode that veto. And so I believe since due to that whole process, I think it actually started taking place or became enacted in early to mid-March. So it's been about a month with the tax in session. It was introduced after Europe's footsteps, so kind of following Europe's footsteps. France and Austria have both introduced a similar tax. France has a 3% tax rate and Austria has a 5% tax rate. So in a way, Maryland is kind of following these European trends and bringing their legislation over across the ocean. And thirdly, it's a bit of a response to COVID trends. Many people have supposed that it's a direct response or indirect response to states seeing their revenues fall short, while big tech saw a major digital push during the pandemic, and so it saw their digital ad revenues increase. And this bill is kind of meant to balance the scale a little bit and allow states to collect those revenues and even out the scales a bit. And of course, we've seen opposition from big tech. There's a class action lawsuit filed by the US Chamber of Commerce and a coalition of industry groups, including Google, Facebook, or that are representing Google and Facebook and Amazon, to name a few of the major players. And the basis of their argument is the Internet Tax Freedom Act, which is a 1998 federal law that prevents state and local governments from taxing internet access or imposing multiple or discriminatory taxes on electronic commerce. So that is the basis for their opposition to the bill, and that is ongoing. So we will see what happens with that in the near future. So Paul Romer's op-ed was what inspired the actual bill. So he's a Nobel laureate for economics. He wrote an op-ed for the New York Times. He suggested an alternative to antitrust laws to avoid the associated externalities of these monopolistic companies that involve price gouging and stifling innovation and undermining the institutions of democracy. To quote him, what he suggests is introducing a state-level sales tax like we see in Maryland. He also suggests a federal level statute, which would be a federal level corporate income tax rate. He's basically quoted saying that the bigger they get, the more they know, and he's citing the unchecked power of big tech that needs to be kind of put in check, to put it simply, as they can be havens for misinformation and hate speech. His argument was on the basis that these big tech companies have a lot of control and it can get out of control sometimes. And the tax itself is a progressive tax, and this is what Paul Romer also suggested. So progressive tax is a higher rate to larger companies. Larger companies will bear the brunt of the tax rate, which will allow newer and growing companies to enter the market and remain more competitive. And this progressive tax rate discourages mergers while also encouraging dispersal. So large companies are less likely to merge as they might face that higher tax rate. But the existing large companies are encouraged to disperse to face these lower tax rates, thus kind of acting as an antitrust law, indirectly motivating these companies to disband themselves without having to go to more Senate hearings and things of that nature. Briefly outlining the details of Maryland's tax rate, they're implementing a 2.5% tax rate for companies making between 100 million and 1 billion. And then on the high end, it's a 10% tax rate for companies making more than 15 billion a year. So I think Facebook and Google both make more than 15 billion a year, so they'll be paying that higher end. But that lower end tax rate is also only implemented on companies that are fairly large, that have these large revenues of 100 million to 1 billion. Okay, next. So this is another point of attack for the big tech companies. They are challenging the vagueness of the bill. The language is not very specific. So there's a lot of questions that arise, such as who is subject to the tax. There's a lot of ambiguity that could lead to tax pyramiding, which occurs when the same final good or service is taxed multiple times along the supply chain. And there's also questions around what transactions are subject to the tax. So the bill defines digital advertising in such a way that it invites taxpayers to challenge its boundaries, and which is exactly what they're doing. There's simple concepts of what can be taxed, such as banner ads. We're all familiar with them. They're on websites. As you scroll, you see a little ad for a shoe or something. And that ad is linked to a Maryland address, which can then be taxed. However, there's also some catch-all terms written into the legislation, such as other comparable advertising services, when referring to sponsored and branded content, email marketing, and even voice over IP sales calls. And then it kind of adds in this catch-all term, other comparable advertising services, which blurs the lines between what is digital advertising and what can be taxed. And finally, another question is what constitutes digital advertising in the state? Since this virtual space, since the space is virtual, the boundaries aren't always clear. So the legislation kind of punts the decision off to the comptroller, who is the final decision maker of what revenue is in the state and what isn't, and what can be taxed and what can't. They are the final call maker, and big tech is basically fighting for more specificity in the tax if it is to go through, or if it is to continue, so that these lines are clear and defined and they can kind of work accordingly. So the added revenue is Maryland decided to pump it directly into K12 education, so that's primary and secondary school. In the first year, it's expected to generate over $250 million in revenue. That can have long-term economic benefits. Investing in education leads to an educated workforce, which leads to higher wages, more equal opportunities. And these are economic benefits that can be seen, like if it's a continued investment, it can be seen for a long, long time. And some of big tech's potential adjustments to the bill, if it continues, is to expand their current model by, which is the ad-supported model. And so since the tax is going to be imposed on these ads, they're likely to raise the costs on these ads. And that cost is likely then to be burdened onto local businesses. But Paul Romer also suggests the space, there's room for a new model for an ad-free subscription service, which exists. We're familiar with things like Hulu offers an ad-free subscription service, for example. And in that case, the cost gets put onto consumers. And kind of diving more into these effects, if ad costs increase in that first scenario, if the current model continues, then advertisers are going to pay more to put their ads on these sites or in these virtual spaces. There will also be higher business costs for those businesses, which will then make it less affordable for local businesses to participate in an advertising campaign, for example, and that could make it so there's a potential revenue loss due to less advertising and less exposure. Another potential effect is a less competitive, a lack of competitiveness in the region. So there's a potential for out-migration of companies to states without that sales tax, so they can afford to advertise themselves. Whereas most big tech companies are out of state, especially the largest ones. They're kind of scattered throughout the US, but like Silicon Valley, for example. Revenue loss, we mentioned that. And then finally, there's also an increased cost to consumers in both scenarios. So the first one, the higher business costs will likely be reflected in their businesses' prices, which will then be passed on to consumers. And the second ad-free subscription model would also direct the cost directly to consumers, and at the same time would decrease consumer choice. Consumers tend to have a preference for free services, and so they'll be kind of guided into those free services as opposed to paying for those subscription services. Finally, so there's other states that are looking at Maryland as an example. Some have tried and failed to implement a tax. I believe Connecticut has tried and failed, but they're still looking to bring it back likely. Connecticut, Indiana, Montana, New York, and Washington are all trying. I believe New York is the only one that is trying not only to introduce a new tax, but to expand an existing tax to include digital ad revenue. So these are just some of the states that have expressed explicit interest in this advertising revenue tax, and it'll be interesting to see how they use Maryland as a case study, since it is the first state to do so. Essentially all eyes are on Maryland right now to see what happens in the coming years and what the effect on the local economy will be, and how that reinvestment will kind of bolster the education system and bolster the local economic outlook, and how those costs will also take their toll. And moving on, we're going to move on to the modeling part now. Hajei will take over in a second, but briefly, kind of what our philosophy is behind economic modeling is to clarify, calculate, and communicate. So modeling can help legislators clarify the complex relationships between policy and their economy, and REMI helps calculate the actual quantitative analytics, and you get some real numbers to communicate to both policymakers and the general public what the long-term effects, what the short-term effects, basically what the macroeconomic outlook will be for your region or your local economy. And it helps get policy right, it helps pass or block legislation. Basically, modernizing and advancing your agency is what economic modeling can help kind of develop. And now I'd like to pass it on to Hajei, who will kind of begin talking about the model scenario and eventually lead into a model demonstration.
Yeah, thank you, Julian. So here we can see a very simple model scenario that we have. We have the cost and benefit analysis in this case. So for the cost side, we think much of the economic burden will fall on local businesses and consumers. So taxing the digital ads will raise the cost of advertising services, especially for businesses rely on advertising to inform consumers about their goods and services. So this new tax will raise their business cost. And many businesses simply cannot absorb the new taxes without passing along some of those costs to consumers, and this cost will get embedded in the final price of goods or services being produced. So that's why in this scenario, we increase the business cost and then assume higher consumer prices. And for the benefit side, this new tax is a new source of state revenue. And in this scenario, we assume all the state revenue, all this new state revenue will be reinvested into education to keep a balanced budget. Before I show more details, let's have a look at the structure of REMI model first. So the structure shows in general how we capture different parts of the economy. Different boxes represent different pieces. So we see the top box is output and demand. That's that one. Well, we have different GDP components: consumption, investment, export, and also the output, which is the amount of production. And the middle box show the labor and market shares. Like the number 3, we have the population and labor supply. So this part show how the migration will drive the local population and will enlarge local labor force pool. And in the bottom, we have various compensation prices and cost of various prices directly. So for example, we have the composite compensation rate and then the composite prices, which will directly link to the production cost. And then the production cost will affect the domestic and international market share, which will again affect the output and exports followed in the diagram. And then the production and then we also have different tax types in this tax PI model. So we have the property tax, sales tax, and we see the corporate income tax directly linked to the production cost, and also income tax linked to the real disposable income. So this structure actually gives us a sense of how the different model components link to each other. And as we know, REMI model is dynamic, so all these linkages can happen over several selected years. And then we could have a look at the model methodology. So here we are using a single region Connecticut tax PI model. As Julia mentioned, Connecticut is also considering this tax. So we choose Connecticut and then treat the state as a whole. So that's a single region. And for the baseline control forecast, we choose the March macroeconomic forecast, which provided by Michigan's research seminar in quantitative economics and can show up the most up-to-date economic situations and prospects. And for the policy variable inputs, we have business cost input for all the sectors, and then overall consumer price increase. And then for the benefit, the new tax is estimated to bring about 250 million new state revenues, and then we will reinvest all this 250 million into the educational services. This scenario simulates the impacts from year 2021 to year 2030. Yeah. So that's a brief outline of how the methodology goes, and I will show the model demonstration now. Dee, could you make me the presenter?
Let me see if I can try that.
Hmm.
Is my screen still being shared or no?
Yeah, you are stopping sharing.
I stopped. Okay.
Hmm.
Sharing. All right, you should be the presenter now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, great. So yeah, so now I just showing the text PI interface. So are we viewing my screen now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah. So as we see now, we are looking at our text PI product interface. So we are using a Connecticut state, and it's a single region, 70 sectors model. We also have 160 sector, which is the most detailed industry level that we have. And we have both the national and regional control forecast, which have all the business as usual economic output and will serve as baseline for our simulations. And firstly, I will show how to run a new regional simulation. We could just click the new simulation here. And now we are going to select the inputs page. So here we have different topics, scenarios, variables. We can just go to the business cost. And we have a policy variable named the production cost that will directly represent the business cost, and then also include like intermediate inputs and then labor costs. So we can choose this one. And then for the option, we have immediate market share response, lagged market share response. We can pick one of them. And for the industry, just pick the industry that you're interested in. And here we could also select all the industries and group them all. And the region is Connecticut by default. And for the unit, just pick nominal millions. Add to the editor. And for the values, we actually have a very useful function. It's the calculator, so can enter different values and then you will fill in automatically for you for selected years and add to input. So now we have a new input business cost setting up, and we could go to the forecast options. So in this page, you could actually drag this box and then to run the forecast according to different years. And then after setting up, you could hit the run button and then you will run for you. And the results will show up in the results page. And we will go to that page soon. So this is how we set up a new simulation. And now we could go to the budget. So the budget is a very unique feature of text PI. So here I'm showing the budget. Okay, as we see, we have revenue categories and also expenditure categories. So all these values are from the Connecticut state budget. And if we go to the personal income taxes, for example, I could just go to the income taxes, and then we have a value entered here. And the second step is to set up the indicator. So here we have the personal income. That means the growth rate of the personal income tax will be linked to the growth rate of this personal income. So that's why we are choosing the personal income. And for the next step, we should choose a policy variable. Here I'm choosing the state taxes because the state taxes will represent the personal income taxes the best, and then you will be entered into the model as a model input, and this value can be changed directly according to different scenarios that you are setting. Yeah, so this is how you are setting the budget for revenue categories. And then we could also quickly look at the expenditure category. For example, we have this educational expenditure that we are interested in, so we could just add it here. And we have a value here, and then go to the indicator. For the educational expenditure, I'm choosing a population here, range from age 5 to age 22. So that's the young population that will receive the educational services. So that's why we choose the population. And then for the policy variable, I chose the state and local government spending. So this is the name of the policy variable, and it will directly enter into the model and function as the model inputs, and it can be changed according to different scenarios. Yeah. So now I'm showing how we set up and calibrating the budget. It is actually quite quick and easy because we have all these instructions and guidance that will help you work through all this process. And now we could go to the forecast that I already set up for you. Okay, so firstly, we could have a look at the input list that we have. So the first one is the education investment. As we know, the estimates show that this new tax will bring in about like 250 million tax revenues. So, and we are going to reinvest this amount to the educational services. So in the modeling, we choose the detailed government output as the policy variable. So that's the shock that we are going to impose into the model. And then there is a state and local government educational services as a detail. So because this one will be the investment in educational services. Yeah, and the amount that we have is for all these 10 years. So this is the first policy variable, and it's the benefit. And for the cost, we increase the business cost for all the sectors. This is for simplicity. There is 66 private non-farm sectors, and you could also select several sectors that rely on digital advertising the most. Here I just pick all the 66 sectors, and the value are decided by their demand for advertising services. And the third one is increase the consumer price. So we have a policy variable named consumer price, and the details is for all the commodities, all the 75 commodities, and yeah, and the year is also this 10 years. So if you add up the increased consumer price amount and then the business cost, these two will be equal to the education investment. So in this scenario, we assume the business cost, the local businesses and the local consumers will pay for the education investment in this scenario. And it's a 50-50 split between the consumers and businesses. And then we could go to the forecast option. As I already mentioned, we could like select the run years. It's like 10 years, and then hit the run button here. And lastly, can go to the result page. So in the result page, there are many different folders. We have our economic summary table, which give you quite a big picture of how the economy looks like in this case. And we also have different types of visualizations on the right side. If you go to the detailed economic, then we have like pretty detailed information on GDP, employment, production, trade, prices. So all these very important indicators. And especially we have all the information by industries. So you can just pick one industry and then have a look. And also, if you go to the detailed demographic, then we have different like population, migrants, special populations, and labor folders. Yeah. So in this case, I just pick some graphs from the economic summary and also some like detailed demographic. I just pick some graphs and then I add them to the favorites part. So in this case, all these graphs will show up in the my favorites, and then just for the purpose of this presentation. And let me set up the comparison type as differences. So in this case, we are comparing our simulation results versus the results in our baseline forecast. Okay, so now we could have a look at our economic impacts. The first one is the GDP and output. We see like both GDP and output are decreasing in 10 years. So let me show the legend here. Okay, so for the output is the amount of productions that includes all intermediate goods and value added. So this can also be sort of the supply side of the economy. So this suggests there will be less economic activities in the region, providing less goods and services. So when the cost of advertising goes up, some businesses may choose to shrink their sizes, or they may go to other neighboring states that don't have the advertising tax. So yeah, so this is part of the reason that they're showing a decrease GDP and output. And then we could have a look at GDP profile by different components. So here, the green line show the GDP. The green line show the investment spending, and then the orange line show the consumption expenditure. And we see like both of them are decreasing in these 10 years. So when there is less advertising, consumer demand will drop. So it will be more expensive for consumers to consume digital contents and also other related commodities. That's why we're seeing like the drop in consumption expenditure. And lower consumption expenditure, lower consumer demand means fewer jobs, and because there are like less business activities going on, so that will create like less job opportunities, and we see the total employment is decreasing. We actually have two categories here. So the total employment is measured by place of work, and then the residence adjusted employment is measured by place of residence. And we see both of them going down, especially in the first several years of the tax legislation, and then they will gradually go back to the normal. And if we have a deeper look at the employment by industry, we see there are different industries here, and we could kind of sort this column. And then and then the construction sector, the job decrease in construction sector is the most among all these sectors. Construction is also one of the largest sector in Connecticut, and also the retail trade, because the supply chain. Through the supply chain, the retail trade also support less job, and also the healthcare services, especially for this one, the professional, scientific, and technical services. This is the upper level for the advertising services sector. So it has a subsector that is the advertising services. So we also see like the job decrease in advertising services. Yeah, so all these sectors hit the most by the job decrease. And then we could have a look at how the personal income looks like. Because now we have less jobs, that means less labor income. So it's natural to see the personal income is dropping, and then also the disposable personal income is dropping. The difference between these two is like personal income include all the income sources by person, and then the disposable personal income is the after-tax is the after-tax income received by person. And lastly, I just show how the economic migrants looks like. You see in the graph, especially in the earlier stage of the tax legislation, there are migrants flow out of the region. So these migrant outflows could mean like less taxes, less human resources, and labor force for this region, which will provide a negative signal for the regional competitiveness, as we mentioned in the previous slides. Yeah, so that's give you a general picture of how the economic impacts looks like. And let me turn it over to Julian for a conclusion.
Great, thank you. I should figure out how to make me the presenter again. Show my screen. Are you all seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So just to conclude, we're going to summarize kind of everything we talked about. New legislation can fill the gaps that have been created by COVID relief spending as we transition out of the pandemic. It holds that potential, but at the same time, the effects of that legislation could raise costs for both businesses and consumers. And in the model demonstration, we saw some of the economic benefits, such as new state revenue being reinvested into education or possibly other sectors, depending on a certain state's priorities. And we also saw the economic costs, such as decreased GDP, job losses, and a less competitive region compared to its neighboring states that don't have that kind of tax. So in summary, the country is watching Maryland and using it as a case study for this kind of legislation that can be used to break up these large tech companies, or at least theoretically break them up. Maryland will serve as a case study for those other states that have expressed explicit interest, and for other states that are maybe just thinking about it now. It'll be interesting to see what pans out in the next couple of years in the state. Thank you all for coming.